You know what's better than trains or Mars? Well, trains on Mars. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books. And not just any books, but another Ian McDonald novel. This time, Ares Express, which came out in 2000. So we're following on in our ongoing journey through the stories of Ian McDonald's. And we will talk about all of them, and at the end I will make an introductory video, so those of you who really know nothing about him will get that as well. I promise this will happen, but for now we're going on in publication order. This is Ares Express from 2000, and we'll do the usual thing. I'll give you a quick introduction, what it is, and then I'll move into spoilers, but you'll get a warning, so in case you're worried about spoilers and a sort of like longer analysis, what we can learn about it, how it kind of fits into the larger work of Ian McDonald, all of that kind of stuff, we'll find out after the spoiler warning, which is me drinking beer. So, let's get started, shall we? Alright, as I mentioned, Ares Express is another book by Ian McDonald. It came out in 2000 and it is a sequel of sorts to his debut novel, that is, of course, Desolation Road. Though, when I say sequel, it takes place after Desolation Road, and it is set in the same world, that being, of course, Ian McDonald's take on Mars, which is called Ares, but, you know, if you know your mythology, you probably figured it out, right? Anyway, it is its own very unique story, and the overlap is beyond, you know, the same setting. One character that shows up in both, and a couple of like references to the earlier one. That's all there is. So you can read each one individually. You can start with this and read the other one, or, you know, whichever way you want to do it. I obviously did it in publication order, so there's that, but you don't have to. Alright, so what is this about? Well, this is about the trains on Mars. As you may or may not know, Mars does have a massive railroad system that does cover the planet, because that's how you transport stuff. That's obviously the Bethlehem Ares Railroad, and we follow people that live on one of those trains and run that train forever, or in this case 12 generations, because our main hero, or in this case heroine, is of course Sweetness Octave Glorious Honeybun ASEM Engineer the 12th. It's a bit of a, you know, mouthful, or, a Gabriel Garcia Marquez-as name, which, you know, it's very magical realism-ish in a lot of ways. So we follow her. She flees from an arranged marriage, and that sets in motion a massive amount of weird events, and we follow her adventures through the world, on her way first away from her family and her train, and then back to her family and her train, and we follow or her attempts to actually get that done, and her grandmother, who's trying to find her and save her from all kinds of stuff. In between, well, the end of the world is coming, and all kinds of other craziness is happening. So that's what you get. I would argue it is slightly more accessible, or, well, more traditional than Desolation Road, in that this one does, in fact, follow a couple of characters along a narrative, whereas in Desolation Road, which was much closer to, you know, 100 Years of Solitude, we followed successive generations on in one specific place, that being the town of Desolation Road. So that is the big difference. From then on, I'm not judging which one I personally like better. I think both have their value. But that's what you get. This is not traditional science fiction in the hard sci-fi or space opera sense. It is much closer to magical realism. It is incredibly over the top. It has all kinds of weirdness. If you like your Terry Pratchett, if you like your Jack Vance, this might be something for you. If you like your Thomas Pynchon, this might be something for you. If you're expecting old school sci-fi, this is not going to be it. And that's kind of the topic of the novel. So be forewarned for all of that. Beyond that, you can read this. It's really good. I loved it. Well, big surprise here. I think it is worthwhile because it is sort of like another mission statement in Ian McDonald's general sort of oeuvre, and what art can be, what he tries to do with art and so forth, and that I think is always worthwhile. So, now that I've mentioned all of this, I'll drink that beer, you go and read the book, and then we'll talk about all the good things. And I really hope you can find the book somewhere. Once again, these are unfortunately really hard to find, but yeah, go find it, go read it, let's talk about all the good stuffs. All right. Now, let's get started with something I already mentioned. This is very much informed by magical realism. And Desolation Road. I always get confused with that one because, I don't know, I listened to the wrong bands, I guess. Anyway, Desolation Road was, of course, a heavily inspired by 100 Years of Solitude, what with, the whole town and the successive generations and all of that. In that regard, this one I would say is more inspired, or takes some inspiration from authors like Thomas Pynchon in a way that the first one did not, in that is more deliberately playing with ridiculousness and playing with ideas of narrative and meta-narrative and so forth. So the over-the-top craziness goes into different directions. That, I think, is the first part to be aware of, and I think that is deliberate, right, in a lot of ways, because all of these authors, postmodern, post-structuralists, all of these authors of the later 20th century, in a lot of ways, wrestle with the questions like, so what if we do art? How can we do art? What can art do? Can we still create meaning? That kind of stuff, and they do it in different ways. Ian McDonald's Ares or Mars is, of course, still very much the same place. It is grand in scale. It is weird. It feels like 19th century steampunk in a lot of ways. It feels like all these, it has a lot of weird vibes of like the fictional weird, or Old West in a lot of in some senses, and that is something that I find really charming, because when we look at depictions of Mars, and we'll get back to that at the end of the conversation here, Mars has been fascinating for a long time, and people have been writing about Mars, and Mars was always sort of a bit of a sort of reflection of what people thought about it when they were writing their Mars stories, whether it's Edgar Rice Burroughs and his weird John Carter novels in the early 20th century, whether it is Ray Bradbury talking about Mars in his Martian Chronicles, which is heavily inspired by, the 1950s and 60s in a lot of ways, 50s. Whether it's Mars in more modern things, where it is either terraformed, or whether it is, a very military base or so forth. We have all of these different reflections of Mars, and in some way, this version does reflect that fictionality, and I think that is deliberate. What comes with it, and I think this is one of those things that takes a while to realize, or there can be a bit of a struggle, is that the language does follow that. Not just like the elements, the bits and pieces in there. McDonald's language is very deliberately over the top here. It has a very sort of like 19th century, early 20th century sound to it. Obviously, you have the long lists of stuff in here, but you also, like, the choice of words is very deliberate and over the top. If you read your 1920s, 30s Weird Tales style pulp stories, for example, they have long lists of like attributes and a lot of like adjectives in a way that you wouldn't necessarily use today. So you have something like that as well, like sort of like more out there, less commonly used words and so forth. And the sentence structure kind of does follow that. And I think that is one way of like dating this sort of in this weird anachronistic way, because this is obviously set far in the future. And I mean, if you read someone like, say, Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, you have a similar approach, where you have a very old-sounding language telling a story about the far future. And I think there are obviously inspirations from Gene Wolfe in here as well. One side effect of that is, of course, that there are a couple of scenes in here where people use slurs, homophobic slurs in particular, but not only homophobic slurs that you wouldn't use today, but that sort of add to that specific sort of approach to narrative, and the society depicted here is also a very rigid, hierarchical, reactionary in a lot of ways society. So the homophobia in specifically like 2 or 3 situations is always in encounters with our main character, our main heroine, that being Sweetness Honeybun, of course, and it is her perspective, but I just wanted to bring it up because there are slurs in here that really feel out of place when you read this, not sort of like understanding or not accepting that context. So that is something. Now let's move on and talk about narrative, meta-narrative, and all of those things some more. As I already mentioned, this is a story about narrative. And breaking of narrative and the need to break narrative in some ways. One key for that is, of course, and it's very explicit in that, is that Sweetness Honeybun at some point, or Glorious Honeybun at some point, gets told that she is in fact a story, or she is a story, or her life is a story right now. That means it follows the rules of narrative and not the rules of, well, realistic life, right? That is, of course, nothing new. We have seen this before. There is the concept of narrative causality that Terry Pratchett uses a lot in Discworld and so forth. But I think what Ian McDonald does here is a larger project, and I think it is one that ties back to his general approach to writing science fiction or fantasy or whatever kind of fiction he is writing. So let's go through all of that one step at a time, and let's start with the first big metaphor. Right, this is the trains. These are multi-generational trains, entire societies on those trains, and these trains obviously run on tracks. That means that it's very difficult for them to diverge, change direction, or anything of the sorts. You might call this very much an image or a metaphor for tradition, for narrative and tradition in a lot of ways. Conservatism, if you will so. Right? You have these societies that can't deviate from what they have been doing for the last 12 generations and will not do so ever again. And in fact, if you play, say, tabletop role-playing games or so forth, the term railroading is exactly used for that when you don't give the players the chance to influence their lives or the game in any way, shape, or form. Now, this is obviously what a lot of written narrative does, so there is a tension here. But I would argue that from here on out, Ares Express is about breaking the narrative or finding new narratives and sort of like fighting structures in different ways through, well, art and through anarchism, which may or may not be the same. Now, there are a lot of people deliberately, explicitly called anarchists in this story, and there are a lot of people that are artists in this story, right? We have the two brothers, we have the two anarchist artists, Cadman and whatever his lover is called. We have United Artists, the Anarchist Collective. We have Harks, well, Devastation Harks, who is obviously a failed artist in a lot of ways. And so art and artists are at the core of this in a lot of ways. And this is, I would argue, about, the potential of art to change structures, to defy structures, and so forth. Now, there are 3 sort of like broader structures. The first one I wanted to look at is societal family structures, right? We have the sort of like dynasties of engineers, stewards, the deep fusion reactor group and so forth on the trains, and with their long traditions, which is, why Glorious Honeybun is Engineer the 12th, for example. But she struggles under these, like, rigid structures, right? She wants to drive the train, but she's not allowed to because she's a girl. She has to go into an arranged marriage and so forth. So her act is an act of defiance and breaking that by leaving the track, leaving that rigid life that was basically predicted for her and laid out for her by following the rules and following the track. She leaves perpendicular to that into her own adventure, which is a story, right? Stories have the power to change those structures. That's the first step that we can look at. There is, of course, another element here, and that is the structures of religion. Famously, there is one key religion, we'll get back to that later, that is obviously that's Devastation Harks and his church, the Flying Cathedral, and so forth. And we'll get back to him in a bit. But once again, religions in any way, shape, or form, like organized religion, is another structure that is all about predicting and organizing and regulating human life and human fate, according to religion, even into the afterlife. So there is another way of like a rigid structure that needs to be broken or can be broken or should be broken if it is not actually leading to the best of all possible worlds. You can read some Leibniz if you want, but that's kind of what this is about in a lot of ways. So we have that second structure, and we have a third sort of like structure that needs to be broken from time to time, and that is, of course, political structure. The big scene in this case is, for me, the scene when Glenn Miller and his band, because obviously Glenn Miller is back in here, together with Grandmother Tal, are coming into the place that name has escaped me, where a xenophobic, proto-fascist governor has just been elected, and through their activist art, they are leading to riots and basically changing the political system there to keep everything in this happy, weird form of disorganization that is Ian McDonald's Ares or Mars society. So art can be used to interrupt that. And that, I think, is the first part that we need to look at. Like, every time it is a form of art that is used to interrupt and break rigid structures, which is, of course, with Devastation Harks, it is Cadman and his lover on their anti-gravity surfboards attacking the Flying Cathedral, which makes for a really cool, scene in a lot of ways. But, that is that. And we have other artists there, which the Cloud Artist, United Artists, which is a fantastic name for a group of anarchist activist artists in a lot of ways. We have all of these groups using art to defy structures and maybe find a new way. It's the story, the narrative of Sweetness Honeybun defying the personal structures of family structures. It is the surfboard anarchists defying the religious one. Well, obviously Honeybun as well, because she is in all of these situations sooner or later. And it's United Artists doing political action by performance art. These are just like the three structures that I wanted to point out. Now, where does all of that go? I would argue that obviously in real life, in our history, there have always been artists. Artists have often and always been, not always, but very often been involved in changing society, in opposing oppression, in opposing structures. That's why you have your Nazis in Germany banning art that what they call, degenerate art. It is why you have, say, the Situationist International being anarchists and artists using weird art and anarchist thought to oppose society in the 1960s. In Paris, for example, you have had this situation in a lot of ways, again and again. So this perfectly makes sense, right? But there is something more, and that, I think, is where we need to talk about the genre of science fiction and what this book does. See, if art is a way to oppose structures, and a way to subvert structures, and a way to change history or change the future, then science fiction as a form of literature that is, or an art form that is always concerned with the future, that is looking at different possible futures, right? Fantasy often looks at, is about inventing impossible worlds and inventing better paths in a lot of words for, escapism and so forth. Science fiction has often been the literature that is about coming up with different futures, with possible futures, and oftentimes has been actively used to change the future. So it is the paradigmatic art form to change the world into better places. And that obviously leaves a science fiction artist with and a lot of power, but also a lot of responsibility, with great power and so forth. So this book, in a lot of, I would argue, is a reflection on the duties or the responsibilities and the options, the opportunities of the science fiction artist. It is very much self-reflexive, looking at the forms of science fiction. Remember when I talked about how there have been different forms of Mars over the history of science fiction? Well, a lot of them show up again and again within this story. And one key element here is obviously what happens if an artist sells out. We know this with Devastation Harks, who famously starts a religion because he couldn't hack it as an artist. Now, those of you who know about, say, science fiction history or the history of, say, Scientology may know of L. Ron Hubbard, who famously started a religion because that's where you get a lot of power and a lot of money, but he was a science fiction author, not a very good one. So this is a very deliberate, illusion here, there, right? That is important to understand. So what we see is that if art and if the idea of being not succeeding with art, there are different ways of doing that. United Artists famously also are a group of artists that has, given over their art to different, or their abilities as artists to the Synod of the Anarchs of Wisdom, to keep the system going, the larger system, which is a volatile system to be sure, but they are doing that. Whereas Cadman and his lover are just doing art for art's sake, without anything, and going like, well, we do this, and we build the massive statues and then blow them up again, whether anyone sees them or not. So we have these different routes that artists can go in this book, but we've left one out, and that is, of course, the Green Man, the narrator. Now, the interesting thing here is the Green Man, once again, is an illusion. If you've read the Book of the New Sun, for example, by Gene Wolfe, there's a Green Man showing up there who can travel through time and who can predict the future and the past in one way or another. I don't think that is not exactly deliberate, but it is the Green Man who tells Sweetness Octave Glorious Honeybun Asim Engineer the Third, or the 12th, that she is a story. Now, who tells a character that they are a story? Well, the writer, the narrator, right? So you could potentially read the Green Man here as the narrator person, or the personification of, or the alter ego of Ian McDonald within this story, which, looking at his depiction in this novel, would probably make Ian McDonald a reptiloid. Who knows? But there's a couple of things that I wanted to end this slowly with, to sort of like fold this all together. When at the end, Sweetness Glorious and Sweetness Honeybun is Glorious Honeybun is sort of like coming back to, or breaking apart, the attacks of Devastation Harks against and saving the world, basically. What we have is a long sort of like flickering through different worlds, different possibilities, and the idea of parallel Mars has been raised before, right? And there are illusions that we have, like the gigantic, four-armed green warriors riding on six-legged beasts. Now, that is, that's a reference to John Carter, for example. There are others that might be allusions to other science fictional versions of Mars through the history of science fiction. So what we see with this version of Mars is that it's just one of the different ideas, the different ways that humans have imagined Mars in the future, and thus also imagined our world and our future. That's where we go back to Leibniz and the best of all possible worlds, because the one that McDonald has set out here is, according to this world, to his narration, the best of all possible worlds, the one that they managed through navigating through parallel universes and so forth, to actually create, where humans and machines can live in harmony in one way or another. It's the best of all possible worlds, which is finally the goal of any science fiction writer, or could be the goal of any science fiction writer or any artist, is by the power of their imagination to come up with the best of all possible worlds, so we, as people in those stories, or as the people reading those stories, can strive to actually make the best of all possible worlds real. Which, pretty good fucking sort of like mission statement for any artist, for any writer, and especially a writer of science fiction. That's where I, want to slowly end this, and think that is where we are in Ian McDonald's career. We have been, going through all kinds of different phases, different places, different ways, and some have been more reflective, looking at the past, looking at colonialism and so forth. Some have been very hard sci-fi and social sci-fi, looking at where we deal with the world right now. This one is very much looking at the artist and what the artist's role in society should be. And it is about, defying rigid structures once they harm, and if they harm, and when they harm humans. And, well, too rigid a structure, whether it is, strong dynasties in those trains, whether it is a familial, sexism and the patriarchy, which is what happens on the trains, whether it is fascism, which is the political element, whether it is a specific manipulative religion, a mail order religion at that, which, once again, this is very much Scientology. That's where art has to come in and has to break up those structures to open up the possibilities so we can find the best of all possible worlds. That's a pretty strong statement. One final bit that I just wanted to tag on, because it doesn't really fit into my general argument that I was trying to make here, is one bit of world building, and that is, of course, the war between heavens and the earth, or the humans and the angels being machines, that being, artificial intelligences. And the war starts because humans get afraid of those artificial intelligences and start the war. This is important because the setup here is that humans create artificial intelligences and machines to build them a better world, and once they fear that those machines might get out of control, that being human control, stop being basically the slaves of humans, that's when humans decide to annihilate the machines. Now, if you've looked at what people who are building artificial intelligence right now are planning, thinking, and so forth about artificial intelligence, this is scary. Now, obviously, that stuff has been around forever, because the relationship between machines and humans is another element of science fiction that has been around for a long time. But I think it's very interesting and important that McDonald sees the role of humans and the relationship between humans and machines this clearly, and that what we want is to create create intelligences that do our bidding, which is basically slaves. And once we fear them slipping control, that's when we decide to annihilate them, which says a lot about humans, says a lot about slavery, says a lot about white supremacy, and all of the elements that are still around in that discussion. But we'll talk about artificial intelligence very soon. I just wanted to bring it up because, maybe it's the lens that I'm seeing everything through right now, or maybe it's in there. Anyway, that's all I have right now. I just really enjoyed it. There's obviously all the really cool and weird bits in here that are lovely, like the time vampire gambler that is card shop, that is stealing people's lives or years of their lives by playing or cheating at card. That's just a really cool weird bit. Grandmother Tal in general is really cool, but also her ability to magically manipulate everything brown is just so out there, and that's where the Thomas Pynchon-esque sort of bits and pieces of magical realism and postmodern literature kind of slip in with those. How far can I push the ridiculousness? And how far can I push it while still making very clear and very explicit points about society? The human furniture one is another one, with a deliberate sort of connection to, say, Dune, where in later Dune books you have such a thing as chair dogs, which are, genetically modified dogs that are used as furniture. So, once again, this is referential in all kinds of directions, and it's trying to navigate through all of that on the way to the best possible world, which is what art should always strive for, and what science fiction in particular should really strive for. Great stuff, right? Anyway, have you actually managed to read Ares Express? And if so, what did you think about it? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Next one, I think, will be River of Gods. That's a reread for me. I'll try to do that relatively soon. Beyond that, I don't know, like, subscribe, comment, join the Patreon if you feel like it, join the channel if you feel like it, do all of those wonderful things, but most importantly, be good people and strive for the best of all worlds. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, thanks and cheers.